So I'm really excited to introduce Penelope Curtis, who's going to be talking about her book today as part of the Architecture Foundation's Book Week. Her book is called The Pliable Plane, The Wall as a Surface in Sculpture and Architecture, 1945 to 1975. And she's going to present her findings about the book. And I'm going to pass over to her now. And yeah, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Maybe I should explain that I can't see myself. I can only see my slides. So hopefully this will not be in a sense like normal Zoom meetings when you're rather focused on your own face, how you look. So my new book is called The Pliable Plane, as Amy said, and that's a quotation from Annie Albers. And in a way that seems to have become a tradition for me now, because my previous book, or rather the book that I see this as being a kind of sequel to, was Patio and Pavilion. And that was also a quotation, obviously, from the Ideal Home exhibition, And This Is Tomorrow. And the Patio and Pavilion project was done by Paolozzi with the Smithsons. The Pliable Plane was a title that I came up with really only at the end when I realized where my new book was heading. And I don't want to go through the book in detail today because it's coming out in 3 weeks' time, but rather just maybe talk a bit about how I was motivated to write it and some kind of general trends from the genesis towards the kind of continuation and evolution of the book. And that is partly to do with explaining why I ended up thinking that title was the right title. But the Patio and Pavilion book was more classical in a way. It was about modern architecture. It took 7 different architects and tried to explore why they felt they needed sculpture or why they wanted sculpture in their buildings. But there was a clear divide between the architecture on one hand and the sculpture on the other. But increasingly, I think over the last 10 years or so, I've been thinking about a place where sculpture and architecture really come together, where you can't separate them. And that was very much, if you were to use a kind of classical definition of sculpture, it would be relief sculpture. But I thought, in fact, the wall was more interesting as a surface, which became very interesting for architects. And architects, I felt, were appropriating or using ideas which they also found in sculpture. But then sculptors were also looking at the walls that were happening in architecture. And there was a kind of trading between the two. I think in a way that you might say, to simplify, architects were taking the kind of rough handmade walls from sculptors, and sculptors were taking the smooth, industrially produced surfaces from architects. So a lot of the book is about looking at that contrast between the rough and the smooth, and the found and the made surface. And it looks particularly at the years from around 1945, or the end of the war, up to about the mid-70s. And that means it goes from a period which was very much about recovering from the war, but also thinking about those wartime experiences of the shelter, the bomb damage, the looking for dark, safe spaces. So in a way, a kind of a very different material sense of the wall, up to the late 60s, mid 70s, when the city centre was really being transformed with glass and aluminium and all kinds of amazing new products, which very much, in fact, had come out of the war, and there was a surplus production in many of those materials which had been driven during the war by the need for military production. After the war was over, that military production switched much more into civil production. Now, I'm beginning here on the presentation with this funny quotation from an American art critic and architecture critic, Jean Perrault, from 1967. And as you see, he writes, "Architecture, as it tries more and more to be simply architecture, becomes sculpture. And sculpture, as it strives for its sculptureness, becomes architecture or merely interior design." So for me, that's a kind of knotty problem that I've been thinking about for a long time now. And especially, I suppose, having experienced the transformation of buildings with computer-aided design, seeing the kind of projects which maybe are emblematized by Frank Gehry or Zaha Hadid, those kind of buildings that are defined almost without thinking as sculptural. And then what does that mean? So I've been trying to think through, what does it mean when someone defines a building as sculptural, or when they define an architecture as a sculpture as architectural? And I've been looking for that middle place. A lot of my thinking tended towards a surface which might be defined as continuous. And I think that has been a leitmotif for me in this book, thinking about the idea of a surface that does not have clear divisions, doesn't have clear endings. And I think it's a very interesting concept in architecture. And it's perhaps very well known in some of the concrete projects and toolings that were made, especially in this famous building, which I spent quite a lot of time thinking about, which is the Art and Architecture building at Yale University in New Haven. So the idea of the continuous surface in whatever material is something that, as you might say, almost wraps around the book. Okay. And I've also been interested in cladding, perhaps at a unfortunate time in terms of what's happened with cladding in London recently. But I was doing a lot of the research for this book in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, a famous building by I.M. Pei. And I happened to be there during COVID, so the building was undergoing a lot of restoration and refurbishment. So they were actually taking the cladding off the building, and you could see its structure underneath. So in a way, this kind of work in progress photograph on the left there of the I.M. Pei building in Washington also came to help me think about what I was working on, which was very much a surface rather than a structure. Okay. And this was actually the view from my office in the I.M. Pei building in Washington. And the way that the light played on the surfaces, I found continuously interesting. And it made me think a lot about the relationship between the optical and the tactical, which is very much a topic in the book, and how the surfaces, which seemed maybe dull in grey light, when there was any light at all, they began to move. And this material, which I.M. Pei had really developed because he had been told he had to clad his building, which probably he wouldn't have chosen to do, because it had to match up to the original National Gallery of Art building. So he had to use the same Tennessee marble, which he did in the cladding on the outside. And then a lot of the inside was made with a ground up marble dust mixed with concrete. So you had this rather amazing pale pink, frosty kind of color, which is set through the building. So that, again, enabled me to think a lot about the inside and the outside and the way that they blend and perhaps don't contrast with each other in the way that they would have normally or traditionally. Okay, let's go back to New Haven. Here we are, the famous A&A building. And I know that a lot of people have written about this building, and it's been an object of fascination since it was put up. But I wanted to think about it slightly differently, and as I say, more sculpturally as well. And I think I found some quite interesting material which relates to Paul Rudolph's thinking about his own building and its relationship with sculpture. Okay. But the surfaces were made in molds, and they were cast, and then they were hand tooled, and the ribbed edges were knocked off with the hammers. So for me, as a sculpture historian, this made me think very much of the relationship between the cast block and then the hand tooling, which will finish it off. And these details, which I took when I was in there, I found very immediately redolent of sculpture and thinking about how sculptors work with casts and then adapt the surfaces. These vertical striations, these famous so-called corduroy cement surfaces, concrete surfaces, Paul Rudolph himself linked very much to his own drawings, which we see here, okay. His renderings, which are an object of fascination in themselves, show this concrete corduroy continuous surface. And he talked about having made the drawings first and then looking for a way in which he could make the drawings make the buildings look like the drawings in real life. So this quality of the the concrete line, linearity of the building may well be linked back and derive its source from his original renderings. Okay, but the other thing I think is particularly fascinating in thinking about the relationship between sculpture and architecture in terms of surface is that Paul Rudolph was very enthusiastic about reclaiming, refinding, and using some of the fine art collection of casts for the art and architecture building. And there are famous stories of how he rescued some from the basement and others from the street. Many of them were still more or less intact. He used them in a very free way. So he had his own kind of radicality in reusing these friezes, which should have been originally one long frieze. He broke them up and he put them inside his own building. And I was interested in the way that his own building was already a cast building, you might say, and then he found casts to add this kind of second interior layer of a cast surface. So there are two sets of images here, images on surfaces, which have been made through casting. So here we have some of the ancient casts, which he had collected from the art school, which had been bought from Europe and reflected different European École des Beaux-Arts fine art schools collections of mainly ancient, but also some medieval, essentially Roman, Greek, and Egyptian friezes. And then as well as the ancient ones, okay, we have some of the more modern ones, the Sullivan casts, and some of the kind of Art Nouveau shallow casting that had been made from famous American buildings around the turn of the century, around 1900. So I was interested there how he was using this new interest, which you might say was very present in Yale University at that time, in looking at alternative sources of modernism, at Gaudi, for example, and Wright, and also Sullivan, thinking about these thin cast surfaces and the way that Paul Rudolph managed to find the right places almost exactly in the building to present these decorated surfaces. And I think I have one more here. Yes, the fact that you find these casts all over the building at every level, I found quite fascinating, and how they play off his own surfaces and their different tactilities, rougher or smoother, but always this hand-tooled and cast surface. And that you see here on the left, the famous interior entranceway up into the school, and then here on one of the stairways, that same frieze. And this quality of the interior, I think, is something that he played on a lot and talked about this, the darkness. And I found that Paul Rudolph seemed to repeatedly express the contrast between the idea of a building as being either a cave or a goldfish bowl. And he was looking either at the kind of darkness of the interior or at the almost obscene lightness and transparency and reflectivity of the modern building. And he worked with both, but he certainly felt that we needed more of the cave in contrast to the goldfish bowl of modern architecture. And that quality of kind of cave-like entrance, which I think we see one more here, the idea of something dark and somewhat unknown, was something that he talked about after the famous arson attack of this building, which had been launched to huge acclaim, but then only a few years later was burnt and substantially damaged, possibly by a disgruntled student, but it was never proven. He suggested that the building need not be completely refurbished and restored, but instead could be used in a new way as a museum of sculpture. And I think that aperçu, or moment into understanding how Paul Rudolph saw this building, which had obviously changed in its status for him, was no longer seen to be fit as an art school or architecture school, but could become a museum of sculpture and different kinds of sculpture, which would be represented by the casts. I think is quite interesting in thinking about the whole building itself as a sculpture and as being a surface that is made and then transferred through the process of casting. I'm going to move from the cave of Paul Rudolph to the caves of Henry Moore. And I worked at the Henry Moore Institute for a long time, but I never actually really researched Henry Moore himself. He was like a constant presence, but I never did a lot of work on his sculpture and drawings. But then beginning to think about the cave in the 1940s and its suddenly kind of new resonance during the war, of course, brought me back to Henry Moore's shelter drawings that he made. I was quite interested to discover that Henry Moore made his first shelter drawing in the London Underground on one of the very, very first nights of the Blitz on London, when he discovered almost by chance all these people looking for shelter, trying to sleep in the underground tunnel. And that led to this famous series of shelter drawings. I discovered that, and it's totally circumstantial, but I thought it was interesting, on the very next day in France, there was the discovery of the caves of Lascaux. And the caves of Lascaux were discovered and verified, but they were kept secret because they were still in the zone. They were being used by the resistance in France against the occupation. So they were keeping weapons in them at the time. So the idea of the cave as something that had a new modernity and a new currency and use at that time, I thought was very interesting, both in Moore, but also in this Paleolithic underground scenario in France and also in northern Spain. And the tunnels in Lascaux, which we see here, this was the first mapping of the underground caves in Lascaux, I thought led to a new way of thinking about the importance of the underground, which was both, in a sense, ecclesiastical, and a lot of these spaces in the caves were almost naturally given names like the sanctuary or the apse or the high altar. And this kind of ecclesiastical naming of space underground in a space that had never been in any way Christian whatsoever, I found that I could map that through into a number of rather interesting and unusual memorials that came out of this period. So we see the very end of the war and into the 40s and 50s, a quite remarkable series of underground war memorials, very often made either in the sites where people had been killed or in sites where people wanted to envisage a kind of place of safety and sanctuary. Okay. And one of those sites, which I look at in some detail in the book, is this rather extraordinary memorial that was designed by Pingusson in Paris. And it's literally almost under the feet of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, but many people don't notice it. And because the architect was asked to keep it low so as not to interfere with Notre Dame, the whole site is sunk, and therefore he creates these very interesting tactile corridors which lead down into first the kind of patio area and then further down into the place where the martyrs, so-called martyrs of the deportation, that's the people who were sent from the camps in France to their deaths, were commemorated. And this memorial is still, you might say, almost literally under the radar, but an extraordinary pièce de résistance, really, and interesting to me, perhaps especially, because although a number of sculptors were asked to collaborate with the architect, in the end, almost everyone realized that the sculptors added nothing to the architecture, which was already sufficiently sculptural in itself. And you can see that here, I think, with the amazing treatment of the entrance into the sanctuary, which you might call it. Every surface is worked in a different way. Some are smoother, some more elaborated, more detailed. And the actual material, again, which is concrete, and it's brought from all the different areas of France, so it has a symbolic signification as well. That tactility comes to represent the whole of France, but also the idea of a place that somehow is on the threshold between a place of threat, a place of imprisonment, but also a place of freedom. I look at a number of war memorials, but I won't go into too many of them here, or it would take too long. But I I found on looking more closely at Henry Moore's drawings, which in a way many of us grew up with, and they're often shown, they're very well known, but I think that people have generally talked much more about the people in these images, the shelterers themselves, and much less about the backdrop. And I began to look more at this backdrop and this curved quality of the underground tunnel, but also the way it's made. And it seemed to me that there was something to be said here about the backdrop to Henry Moore. And perhaps that helps us to understand how he himself was working with architects and thinking about the relationship of sculpture to architecture, but also the figure to the background. Okay. And I discovered a suite of drawings that I never had known before, which Henry Moore was commissioned to make after a radio broadcast of a new version of the Odyssey, which had been put out during the war. And it was very much transformed into a kind of modern day story. It was called The Rescue. It was a version written by Eddie Sackville West and with music by Benjamin Britten. But these amazing drawings of Odysseus in the cave, which you see here, I think really caught Henry Moore's imagination. And he began to think a lot about the cave and this curved surface, and also about that particular structure and what it represents of the man who is both shipwrecked and isolated, but also on his way home. So it was very much a story for the wartime, but I think also began to inform Henry Moore in thinking more about the environment in which the figure is found. Okay. And for me, the building where I think you can begin to understand what I'm talking about is the UNESCO building in Paris, which was built by a team of architects led, I think it's fair to say, by Marcel Breuer. And Marcel Breuer and Henry Moore really began quite a close and productive relationship here. And Henry Moore visited the site in Paris much more often than he tended to visit sites where he had commissions. And he and Breuer had an interesting correspondence in which I feel that, in a way, Breuer began to think about the curve, and in a way that reflects the way that Henry Moore was thinking about the curve, and that Breuer's wall became more sculptural and Henry Moore's figure became more architectural, and they both realized to what extent they could depend on the other and didn't need to rival, but could use the other with a kind of confidence and assurance. And that curvature of the wall, of course, is something which Breuer had already explored in the 30s, but became increasingly a signature for him, something that he developed notably in Washington, which I was able to go and see. And especially the chiaroscuro, the dark and light effect of the wall itself, the kind of a cross between an image and a built structure of masonry. The image of the wall, I think, becomes really interesting. And Henry Moore made a lot of maquettes with a curved wall behind them. They're not normally referred to in terms of this curved wall of Breuer, but I think you can see that interplay here between the sculptor and the architect, and how the wall becomes really sculptural in itself. Okay. And there I think you see how Breuer's facade is wall-like in a traditional sense, almost like a built wall with the masonry. And you see Henry Moore's figure in the foreground there in its original position. But thinking about that built wall, I think, is something which is going to figure in Henry Moore's work for the next decade or so. Okay. For example, in this really anomalous piece that Henry Moore made in Rotterdam at the Bouwcentrum, he was commissioned to make this piece for the building centre. The only condition was that he had to work with bricks, which he'd never done before, but which became very interesting for him. He made quite a lot of very small designs for this project, and he was quite careful to tell the bricklayers, who were apparently senior bricklayers who were near retirement or had come out of retirement, to make this work, because it was highly skilled and challenging. And Henry Moore wanted it kept saying he wanted it to be like bricks, not to disguise the fact that it was made from bricks. He was looking for this really kind of subtle midway place between an architectural wall and a sculptural motif, but also something that revealed its own medium and the way it was made. And there are a lot of interesting photographs in the Henry Moore Foundation archive which show the wall being made. And of course, as walls are, it's made from the bottom up. So you see it being kind of laid course by course in a Flemish bond. So there's this sense also of an interlocking or interweaving of the material, which became increasingly important for me in thinking about what a wall is and how it stands out, but also how it might inspire a sculptor or an architect to think about its kind of plastic possibilities. Okay. And coming back to this same book or play, The Rescue, the version of the Odyssey by Sackville-West, I noticed that quite a number of the drawings, both the published ones in the book, but as well also in his sketchbook, Henry Moore has become really quite fascinated by masonry and the way that masonry interlocks, but also in shadows. So here there's a shadow on the wall. It's an invented scene in which we see the profile of Odysseus, who's disappeared, has been traced on the wall as a kind of souvenir while he's away. So this idea of the shadow, but also the friable surface of the wall and the interlocked surface is something I think that Henry Moore is very interested in. And I certainly became more and more interested in it too. Okay. And in the same book, we have my namesake, by chance, Penelope, weaving. And then I realized that a lot of Henry Moore's drawings around this time, mid-40s, late 40s, show weaving. And I feel that there is a real intersection between thinking about how a weaving is made, this plaiting, interlocking, warp and weft. And there's a lot of that imagery in his drawings for this Odysseus play, relate also to the way that a wall is made. So I think that he's thinking quite deeply about this shallow structural bond, which might not necessarily be fully structural, but will hold together. And by that, I mean that if you go back to the Rotterdam wall, it was never structural. And in fact, the wall was taken away when the building behind it was knocked down and rebuilt. The wall was removed in one piece, kept safely, and then returned to the new building and placed in front of it. So in many ways, it's much more like a hanging or a curtain almost than a wall in reality. And that idea of a wall as a hanging, I think links both to an artist such as Moore, who was quite interested in tapestry at this point, but in a wider sense to more artists, thinking both about kind of classical roots of the hanging or the cladding of a wall, and will end up, I think, in thinking about an artist such as Annie Albers and the way that she's thinking about cladding as a loose, semi-transparent, pliable plane, which does not hold a building up, but is present in front of a building. Okay. So now we've got to Annie Albers, and this is one of her famous diagrams from her book on weaving. And I could have chosen many, many images here, and I think they show this conjunction of symbol and line, and thinking about how patterning is also structural and can create a form that is built, even if only in shallow depth. And Annie Albers and Joseph Albers were both very interested in going to Mexico. They went fairly regularly. And those journeys have now been quite well documented, and their early photographs have been shown, and how much they were interested in Mexican brickwork. Henry Moore also went to Mexico just once, but he was interested in the same things. This kind of shallow, light and dark brickwork, which can add up to the most amazing patterning, but with very, very simple means. And this work that Annie Albers had been elaborating throughout her career on weaving, I think it was really coming to a climax at this point, and she had just been showing in a solo exhibition at MoMA, and her work was always closely connected to the work of her husband, who at that time was certainly more famous, but perhaps now it's becoming more equalized. But I would say that this work by Annie Albers can be closely related to a nearly contemporary piece by her husband, okay, Joseph Albers. And this is one of several fireplaces that he made. This one is in Harvard in the Harkness Commons, which had just been designed by Gropius. And Gropius employed a number of artists to come in and work on the space with him. And I think you see here an increasingly sophisticated conjunction of sculpture and architecture. And whereas the UNESCO building in Paris, for example, was really seen as not very successful, especially in the fact that the fine art commissions by artists like Leger and Picasso and Miro were really clearly not part of the building and had no sense of belonging properly to the building. Whereas here in the Harkness Commons in Harvard, Gropius seemed to have chosen artists, sculptors, architects who could work with him in a way that was much more integrated. So here we have this rather remarkable fireplace surround in the Commons building. And Annie Albers also made partitions or room dividers. So there was a very, very nice close relationship between the way that Annie Albers was using weaving, the way that Joseph Albers was using brick, and finding these different courses to subtly shift direction or to focus the eye in one way. That kind of optical illusion in very shallow depth was used to great effect. So these kind of woven reliefs are something that I look at in some detail. I think I have here an image by Mary Martin. This is a piece that Mary Martin designed but never saw installed for the University of Stirling. It was put up in the new University of Stirling building and opened in 1969. But Mary Martin, interestingly enough, had also been a weaver and had taught weaving at Chelmsford. She had been head of the weaving department there. So I think it's fair to say that she too was thinking about this in-out quality, and also at a very careful mathematical thinking about permutations and how permutations of quite simple elements, simply by turning them on their turning them 45 degrees or 90 degrees, you can use a reduced set of elements and a quite reduced palette of materials to make quite extraordinary effects. And one of the things I talk about in the book is how the increased availability of standard component building materials, and especially at that time she was working with aluminium, but also asbestos, in fact, allowed artists like her who were not resistant to modern materials to think about how simple permutations could have really quite interesting effects in buildings and also fit in with the context of the building, because ultimately they were made of the same material as the building was. And I think that's a big difference. So this is not a fine artist placing a painting in a building. It's rather an artist thinking about what is this building made of and how can I use those modular elements and those materials differently than the architect might have, and yet find a way that is sympathetic and in keeping with the overall material structure of the project itself. And okay, some of the other wall surfaces I look at, I'll just touch on here because I think that they give a flavor of the range of projects that were happening at that time, and which I attempt to think about in terms of different treatments of the wall surface. But one of the artists who I looked at is this artist, Costantino Nivola, who was an Italian with a very craft-based Italian background, but who was canny enough to get to New York at the right moment to meet up with not just Corbusier, but many of the emigre, exile architects who were settling in New York at that time. And Costantino Nivola created these very, you might say, almost traditional surfaces for them. So this is in the Olivetti showroom in New York from 1954. And what Nivola is doing, I think, is something that is kind of rural and semi-archaic, but also fitting into a modern environment, and it gives it a kind of body and texture, which otherwise the building would lack, and somehow warms it up, makes it feel more like a place you might want to spend more time in, which is what commercial interiors need and want. And another example is this work by Jorge Orteza in the Basque Country. Orteza had also looked quite a lot at Moor's works from the 1930s, and during the war, during the Spanish Civil War, and later he was in South America working a lot with ceramics. But he came back to the Basque Country and did some of these amazing walls, which he described as light walls. He tried to find a lightweight wall. They're very thin, and they're normally made of stone or plaster, have a combination of slightly raised and slightly recessed elements. So in a more subtle way than Nivola, he's looking for a wall that is alive, a lively wall, a speaking wall, you might say. And again, they're being put into quite modern interiors. He was working closely with patrons who were heavily involved in the cement industry, concrete industry in Spain. So very often using their own materials to find a way in which he could offset the modern industrial interior with something that was more archaic and had a greater sense of history about it. And I think it's true to speak of that because he was certainly very interested in the Neolithic works, Neolithic legacy that you can find in the Basque Country. And then I'm just going to kind of close off now with where the book ends up, which is something rather different, but still very much about the wall, but it's a very smooth wall. It's a clad wall with no clear differentiation. So I end up with a very different wall, which I think for me, it's all about the idea of the empty volume inside. And I found that these buildings from the mid-60s, and this is a good example, it's by Victor Lundy, and it's the tax courts in Washington, which was seen as a great success when it finally opened. It was delayed because of the Vietnam War, but when it was put up, people were astounded and impressed by this huge volume, which was cantilevered out from the back of the building for the tax courts. And this sense of extraordinary virtuosity in the way that the cladding represented something that did not end up looking heavy. And when you go to this building, there's no sense of oppressiveness. You don't feel that it's going to fall down upon you. You don't feel that you're going to be crushed. Instead, it's just an extraordinary engineering feat. But this amazing volume, which is almost suspended above you, is clad in these sheets of marble. And yet you understand that the marble is not making the wall, it's simply the surface on the wall. And this reminded me very much of what was happening in minimalist sculpture at the same time. I was looking, I suppose, Donald Judd would be the most obvious example, and thinking about these empty volumes and the idea of a smooth surface which wraps that volume round, but is not expressing any kind of interior. And my sculptural example, move on, would be particularly a sculptor who's not as well known as the small group of minimalists who've kind of come down to us, like Judd and Andre and Flavin. But this is by Ronald Braden, who was a great star at the time, and in the Primary Structures exhibition, which launched the minimalist school, you might say, as such. This sculptor Braden was perhaps the star of that exhibition. And this piece here, which is called Riff, I think is interesting in terms of expressing some of the same forms and values. I think there's a quality of enormous scale, but in a sense, a cross between heavy and light, kind of disequilibrium, something that which looks like it ought to be lying another way. Somehow its center of balance seems to be off center. And these very, very smooth surfaces, which express a hollowness on the interior. And I think that that's something you see in a lot of minimal sculpture, but I thought that Braden in a way expressed it perhaps best and earliest. And I'm going to end up with Larry Bell, and this is more or less where the book ends as well. So I'm thinking here about the idea of the wall or surface as something that is almost dematerialized, and the way that the kind of second generation of minimalists, especially in Los Angeles, were working with some of the materials that had come out of World War II, some of these plastics and glasses, which gave most extraordinary effects in the gallery. And whereas Larry Bell had begun by making cubes of different dimensions and had learned how to mirror them himself by buying disused semi-industrial equipment from old craft shops in Los Angeles, by the time he's got to this point here in, I think this is 1972, and he has a group show. He's one of 3 artists showing in the Tate. This is in the Devine Galleries in Tate, Britain as it is now. So these glass walls are simply stuck onto the floor with a little bit of adhesive glue. And although you see no people here, what they expressed was this amazing sense of the absorption of the viewer and the reflectivity, which in a way echoes the way that my previous book, Patio and Pavilion, ended, because I ended with Dan Graham and the idea of the viewer being absorbed by the architecture or not absorbed by the architecture. Here, I was thinking also about what's happening in architecture more generally, as expressed, I think, really memorably by Jacques Tati in the film Playtime. And he made a whole modern Paris, which was really a kind of, you might say, a game of smoke and mirrors, so that the tourists, especially American tourists who go to see old Paris, only ever see it reflected in the glass of new Paris. And that idea of a kind of dissolving wall and a dissolving architecture, I think, brought me to a kind of natural close in the book. I felt that thereafter there was a lot of work done by conceptual artists and artists, for example, like Thomas Schutter, thinking about the wall. The wall becomes almost like a subject in itself. For me, the Jacques Tati, Larry Bell kind of dichotomy ended up quite nicely as a kind of a chimera-like disappearing wall, which I felt took me from something that was very solid in the cave of Henry Moore or some of those people who'd thought about the curved surfaces of the underground, through the cast and the clad, through to this final chimera-like wall, which is not a wall. So that is my attempt to give a kind of run through the motivations for this book and where it gets to. I would say it's not a survey, it's like an illustrated essay. And I've tried to understand for myself and to satisfy some of my own curiosity about how sculpture and architecture come together on the wall in this period.